everybody to the Travelling AIMS Tropical Division. We're really lucky to host the Travelling Orator. We're really, really grateful to AIMS for allowing us such an eminent speaker to come up and speak to us, someone with many years of experience. I'm sorry I didn't read a bio, but lots and lots. I've been hearing in the car how much experience. And great topic, one that encompasses everything. So people from nursing staff right through to clinicians will enjoy this. I'm really looking forward to hearing the music. So without any further ado, I'd like you all to welcome Jeff Magrin. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. You could have cut the old bit out, though. Really. That's rule one of talks. You've got to start strong. And of course, someone in the audience recognised the song straight away. So, yeah, if I had brownie points or chocolates, one would be going your way. We're going to go back a long way, because in the beginning, God spoke to man, and transfusion was one of the topics. The feature of what I want to do tonight is I want to mix art with science, and there's been a number of major innovations in blood transfusion, and I've tried to find a painting from that particular year that symbolises everything, so that it'll give you a little bit of culture as well as science. Why do we need to go back to the beginning? The earliest references I could find about blood and transfusion are in the Bible. Leviticus is book 3 of the Old Testament, and it's written in old style English. It basically says you're not allowed to eat blood. You have to remember, in those days, they're fairly brutal, and the thing was, in hand-to-hand combat, you were covered in blood. In fact, people used to smear the blood of their opponents or the vanquished on themselves, and it said, you shall not eat blood. There's other Deuteronomy, for anyone who's a Monty Python fan, will know about Deuteronomy. You shall not eat blood, and you shall pour it upon the earth as water. This is the basis for Jehovah's Witnesses not having transfusion. So I cannot quite work out why you would risk your life on a paragraph that's over 2,000 years old. But that's what it's all about, and that's how far back we go. I'm going to try and provide you with a few examples of the advancements in transfusion therapy and the science. And nearly always, sadly, they are a result of the increased destructive nature of modern weaponry. Physicians have been keeping up with modern weaponry since time immemorial, when it was knives, swords, arrows, spears, machine guns, and landmines. They have all impacted enormously on the science. Just a little bit about art and science though, and Robert Root Bernstein will talk to anyone who will listen to him. He's the professor of physiology, and he believes that most people are at a loss to identify a connection between art and science. He's very vocal. The ignorance is appalling. Art provides innovation through analogies, models, skills, structures, techniques, methods and knowledge. Art doesn't just prettify science or make it more aesthetic, they make it possible. And to further that point, he said, computer chips that run everything these days are a combination of 3 classic artistic inventions: etching, silkscreen printing and photolithography on a little silicon chip. The stitches that commit surgeons, the special stitches that they developed for stitching heart transplants up, and other ones were invented by an American surgeon, Alexis Carrel, and one of his ancestors also appears in the talk as a precursor. He developed the stitches from his knowledge of lace making. The pacemaker that's in people's hearts is a modification of a musical metronome, and the stents that they use in aortas, particularly for aortic aneurysm repairs, are based on the principles of origami. So he makes a fairly compelling case as to how art and science go together. Always like to start a talk with the end. So we'll go to the conclusion, because as Donna will know these days, when presenting a talk, you should tell everyone what you hope to teach them and what they should know at the end, and then you tell me if I've missed the point. The main thing is to spark your interest. The research for this is enormous. I've got a list of references at the end which go back over 2,000 years. If you really want to find out a particular reference, pass them on to Donna and you're welcome to go back and look. There is one feature I think will become very evident. Good ideas, particularly in science, take a long time to catch on. Blood has been a commodity for a long time. I've already said we've been keeping up with the military, trying to save people. In its current form, it really is an art when you consider everything from vein to vein, donation to recipient. There is still no substitute for it. Another bit of music. The question is, rules and regulations. Okay, who knows that one? Oh, come on, there's a few old people in here besides me.
Stills and Nash.
Crosby, Stills and Nash, very good.
I saw Nash.
One of the good references, and it's not really in mainstream science, is a book by Douglas Starr called Blood. And the documentary of the book was presented on SBS a few years ago. And they spoke of it more as a commodity, that you've got a liquid that was always the liquid legend of life. But once society learned how to break it down, manage it, and then sell it, it became priceless. So he defined 3 periods of time, and I've put a 4th one in because it's my talk. He's talked about the transformation from the early days. So you're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to bathe in it because it's got magical properties, and if you take someone else's blood, you take their life. Over the 20th century, it moved from that magical, mystical thing to a therapeutic liquid. In the first 20 years of the 20th century, 1920 on, as scientists learned how to master the resource, fractionate it, develop it, and stuff that we take for granted now, it becomes something more than just culturally significant. It became a weapon of war. I can show you evidence that the Western civilization's ability to utilise blood probably was one of the reasons why they won in the end. And then, of course, after that, period 3 is when someone realised, hey, we can make money here. And that goes on, and it's moved on now to the point where organ transplant, major surgical techniques require enormous transfusion support. Period 4 is happening, and it's happening here in Australia probably at the forefront, and it's risks. People risk that they're realising it's risky. Hemovigilance, adverse event reporting, the fact that they're worried about waste, that it's a limited resource. Infusion is now subject to evidence-based medicine. You really need to know what the transfusion trigger is, and consent and transfusion guidelines, which everyone doesn't want to go near because it's just too damn hard, but everyone wants to know, and you've got to have regulations. So they're coming. If we go back in time further though, 500 BC, anyone who does a master's gets to read the book The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And you can't really see the 13 principles about laying plans, waging war. They work in corporate business. They apply the same principles. The things that I thought you should consider was he always said, war is a necessary evil. It must be avoided whenever possible, but it should be fought swiftly to avoid economic losses. The art of transfusion is intertwined with wars, and we'll come to that. The importance of positioning in military strategy. The decision to position an army must be based on the objective conditions in their physical environment. So too is where transfusion is coming to now, with evidence-based medicine, with all the paperwork and stuff you've got to do. But more importantly, anyone who's, and I worked for the NBA so I can say this, anyone who's had to deal with the bureaucracy, he thought that strategy was not planning, in the sense that working through an established list doesn't work. Strategy is about being able to make quick and appropriate responses to changing conditions. Anyone who deals with the bureaucracy knows that planning is in a controlled environment, and in a changing environment, which we work in, competing plans always collide, creating unexpected situations. So, strategy rather than planning. This becomes very evident with the research that was done in World War II, which wouldn't be allowed to get done today. But we'll keep that up there for you to think about. So why would you transfuse? If you want to transfuse, the basic principles are you would have to understand anatomy. Well, the circulation wasn't discovered till about 1628. You needed to have the technical means, needles, syringes, bags, bottles, whatever. You needed a rationale, and it had to be fairly easy to use. Blood really did get a bad rap because for many years they didn't try putting it in, they tried taking it out. You've got any number of devices up here, blades and everything else, cupping, where they would actually, thought it was good to bleed you. And in fact, the euphoric effect people thought they were getting was probably because they were losing so much blood that they're actually either going to faint or were on the verge of circulatory collapse. Even our good old friend here, Orator Medicinalis, the good old leech. Blood was considered one of the 4 humours that occupied your body, and it was thought to contain all the bad humours, so that you had to get the bad stuff out. So if you bled someone, all the evil spirits would come out. Mayan royalty would shed blood in an attempt to connect with the spiritual world, and it was used for fever, headache and mental illness, and was condoned by every religion and medical school in the world. A 12th century poem from the medical school in Salerno highlights this. Bleeding the body purges in disguise, for it excites the nerves, improves the eyes and mind, and gives bowels exercise. It brings sleep, clears the thoughts, and sadness drives away, and hearing strength and voice augments each day. How can you argue with that? Interestingly enough, in 1628, an Arabic scholar, Ibn al-Nafis, actually described the minor circulation of blood in the body, particularly the pulmonary circulation. But because it was in Arabic and not in mainstream Europe, it sort of got lost. And it's rather ironic that an anagram of 1268 is 1628, was when the British physician William Harvey discovered, or is credited with discovering, the circulation of blood. The real point was he published it. And I can understand why there was a bit of reluctance, because in 1553, Michael Servetus was burnt at the stake for heresy by the Catholic Church, just before he was about to publish his findings on the discovery of the pulmonary circulation. So there wasn't really a lot of incentive to, give some really big scientific ideas, particularly if the church didn't like them. The bit of art from 1628 is this one. Nicolas Poisson did a whole series of artworks, always with shepherds and always around a cask, and a very clever author by the name of Dan Brown got hold of some of these and was using some of the quotes. The one on this one is simply says, et in Arcadia ego, which means I too once lived in Arcadia, and Arcadia was a country town which was supposed to be blissful, idyllic, and everything else. But somehow Dan Brown managed to turn that into, the Da Vinci Code and made a lot of money out of it. It wasn't really considered the thing to do, to be cutting up bodies and doing autopsies, even though Leonardo was doing it a bit earlier. But as you can see from 1632, Rembrandt, a reputable painter, painted one of the first in a series of someone doing an autopsy and looking at everything. And that combined with the knowledge of the circulation led this gentleman here, who we all know as Sir Christopher Wren, who's the famous architect, but in fact his initial job was Dr. Christopher Wren. And in those years, between 1632 and 1665, he did a lot of experiments with the infusion of fluids, usually into animals, and published his findings in the Royal Society Journal, which was the then scientific publication of the day. If you got there, that was it. 1665, two gentlemen almost simultaneously across the English Channel came up with the idea of transfusing. I couldn't find a picture of Professor Denise, but Richard Lower is credited with the first recorded successful transfusion, and that's the actual article that was published. I managed to get a picture of that, and in it, of course, they all wrote in Latin. He states that he infused an individual, Arthur Koga, with 9 ounces of blood from a lamb in return for a sum of 1 guinea. It's the first paid transfusion. The patient was described as a subject of harmless insanity. Lower stated, I have no doubt that in lunatics, as much benefit is to be expected from the infusion of fresh blood as there is from the withdrawal of old. Denis was a little more pragmatic. And this is his paper here, which is in French, and he was in fact the professor of philosophy and mathematics, which is an interesting occupation for someone who's trying to transfuse people. 5 months earlier, in 1667, he performed the first transfusion in France and commented on the potential of transfusion to replace blood loss and to treat disease. 1667. It was his belief that transfusion should be done with blood from the same species. No sheep or goats or anything being transfused. But he later rejected this due to the perceived risk to the donor. And it's interesting these days that if you talk to Red Cross, their primary responsibility is to look after the donor. Blood donation, particularly these days, was a risky business. The reason for the painting there is that his famous painting is the girl with the pearl earring, but I thought that looked like a red cell. So I thought that was fairly hematological. More music. Anyone recognise it? Very good. Requiem.
Yes.
Congratulations. I wish I brought some chocolates along for the morning.
Everybody does.
Unfortunately, a patient, Antoine Moroy, who was again someone who was ill at ease, had been transfused with calf's blood, and he was so ill at ease he had escaped from his wife's control. He was transfused twice successfully, but on the third occasion had what was possibly described as the first transfusion reaction ever. It was described as a heat going up his arm, a fever, and the next day he passed bright red urine. Undeterred, they transfused him again and he died. As a consequence, the wife sued. Transfusion was banned by the Faculty of Paris and was banned by most countries. In fact, even across the UK. The tragedy is, and there is a wonderful book called Murder, Blood and Mystery, and they went back and they investigated it. Antoine Moreau did not die from the transfusion reaction. He was poisoned. And there was a good reason why he was trying to escape from his wife, because she was the one that poisoned him. Along with, ably assisted by two physicians who didn't like the idea of people getting transfused. Now, when I said to you earlier, sometimes good ideas take a long time. So from 1660 until 1818, transfusion was not practiced. And it wasn't until 1816 that an individual, John Laycock, established the principle of the donor and recipient should be the same species. And you have to be careful before you publish something. This gentleman here, James Blundell, and I didn't realise there was a very prestigious annual award awarded, the Blundell Award, and it's in recognition of this guy who, and that was the painting of the year, wandered above the sea of folk because he was an obstetrician. The mortality rate, postpartum hemorrhage, was unacceptably high, and most of his peers thought, well, you know, that's one of the hazards of childbirth. He didn't see it that way, and he was actually transfusing people. That's his original transfusion of blood by the syringe and the actual publication itself. That is his 1818 publication from the Lancet, which still survives today, and I managed to get a scan of it. And he developed a device called the impeller, and that's the diagram. And basically, if you were the donor, they sliced you open here, you direct the bloodstream down into what is basically a funnel, along a long tube, which I believe may have actually been the intestine of an unfortunate animal, and using a quill to get into the vein of the recipient. And he describes that the first blood transfusion, 12 to 14 ounces from several human donors. They had a whole lot of people lined up, you know, slash, hold your arm over there, bleed into here, please. Of the 8 transfusions he tried, the first 4 were successful. Now, if you think about it, if you took random blood out of the fridge, there's a 60% chance it'll be compatible, 40% chance it won't be. So the odds and the percentage survival rate he had pretty much reflected that. At the same time, surgeons were starting to publish and realise that blood loss resulted in shock, and John Bell, whose paper is there on principles of surgery, he's known as the father of surgical anatomy, excuse me, declared that hemorrhage is what surgeons fear most. And Marshall Hall, in 1830, English physician and physiologist, published his findings on blood loss and denounced the practice of bloodletting. 1830 was a very good year, because anyone who's a Coldplay fan will know that that's the cover, and that's the painting by Eugene Delacroix, 1830, Liberty leading the French people, and that was the year of yet another one of the French revolutions. So it was a revolutionary year, because people were questioning surgery, and also you're not allowed to bloodlet anymore, no more leeches. Further reviews by Chas Jennings found that transfusion was life-saving, not in 41%, 49% of the cases. And he recommended transfusion for severe hemorrhage. The biggest problem was there was no anticoagulant. And the first attempt, and you'll see a list later on, by a guy called Braxton Hicks, who's famous for other obstetric things, attempted to use sodium phosphate as an anticoagulant, and that killed the patient, which really wasn't what you wanted. And of course, that year, 1884, was the George Seurat's painting A Sunday on La Grande Jatte. If we look at the 19th century, and I hate to find a way to put, scream in. If we look at the late 19th century, transfusion was happening. It was still technically difficult. There was a very high risk of reaction, 1 to 2 or 3, so every second transfusion had a reaction. It was very successful at volume restoration. Blood typing was still unknown. Storage wasn't possible. There were no guidelines or limited indications. And the coagulation was a problem, so it had to be direct. And if you heard me say earlier about Carrel, well, one of the earlier ancestors, George Carrel, came up with the direct transfusion technique, but transfusion was rarely used in surgery. In fact, George Cryle, that's his publication, and you can see here how the difficulties with a cannula from the radial artery into the femoral artery. So you really were in close proximity, just about putting your arm in someone else's groin and having someone there with a set of artery forceps, hoping that it would flow the right way. Remember this, because this practice was what was used for quite a long time afterwards. If I just take you out of the time warp for a second, my own experience at the Alfred was the legendary haematologist there, John McLean, had this device built based on a Scottish prototype. And it's a peristaltic pump, and the idea was, you can see the picture from his paper there, needle and tubing into there and into the other one, and you just pumped. You had to make, and they did make one modification, they put a ratchet on it because you didn't want to go the other way, because the person who was anemic would end up, making a donation rather than... The important thing there the rotary pump was actually devised by an engineer, Noel, in 1870. So here we are, 1870, and someone at the Alfred's actually gone and built one in 1939. So again, the idea took a little while to catch on. The interesting thing was, in the publication, and I'm not going to get you to read the small print, he published that they used it on patients who were continually bleeding, sometimes leukemic patients, APML patients, and found that the direct transfusion method would dry the patient up when stored blood wouldn't. And it's only when you look back at it in retrospect, that was the first reported case of fresh blood having a better effect than stored blood, but it wasn't realised at the time. 1901. And the good news about 1901 is Picasso was actually painting pictures that actually made sense, except they were all blue. And Landsteiner came along. Now, everyone in the room who's got any sort of background will know that Landsteiner found blood groups. And so he did. But Landsteiner was only doing work from the late 19th century. There had been considerable work involving immune practices, with physiologists showing blood from other species would destroy the cells of transfused subjects. It was noted that there was a reaction, which they called agglutination, which could occur between individuals of the same species. But it wasn't until 1901 where Landsteiner described 3 different types of reaction, when he got Blederle staff mixed all their blood, that we got what he called the A, B... Yes, thank you. And he left it at that, and he went off and became an immunologist. He suggested that it might be good, in transfusion practices, but despite his advice, these advances, surgeons continued to perform the transfusion without any preliminary cross-agglutination testing, and still did Cryle's direct transfusion. This is where it got interesting. In 1909, a Czech named Jerry Jansky described all 4 blood groups, because you've got to remember, Landsteiner described A, B and C, and one of his other students described A, B about 4 years later. Independent, without knowing any of this, because it wasn't published anywhere, Jansky came up with the 4 blood groups, and he called them 1, 2, 3, 4. Independent, and without any correspondence, a chap named Moss in America in 1910 came up with the same thing, but he went 4, 3, 2, 1. It wasn't, and Ottenberg and Kalinsky in 1930 described the beneficial outcome of pre-transfusion compatibility testing on cross-matches in 128 patients in the Mount Sinai Hospital, based on the Moss system, not Landsteiner. It wasn't until 1939, at a meeting in Europe, where there was a common nomenclature decided upon for the ABO system. So possibly the most important discovery in transfusion, the ABO system. Everyone says, oh yeah, Landsteiner found it in 1901. 1939, before there was a common nomenclature, and in fact the real person who probably discovered the whole system and put it together was a guy called Jan Jansky. And posthumously in the last 5 years, there was actually an award called the Jansky Award in Europe in recognition of his findings in the ABO system. The lesson here is don't publish anything in Czech, because no one reads it. Of course, Landsteiner went on to win the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1930, and he did cover himself in glory in 1940 when he, with Weiner, discovered the Rhesus system. I said to you earlier on, all the major advances have been by battlefield. Blood group cross-matching and anticoagulation was facilitated. Indirect transfusion was needed by the military. Battlefield transfusion relied on having your donors, and it was usually the other soldiers, and it was, we need some donors. All the people who are Group A, please step forward. They introduced tank warfare in World War I, which meant you could mobilise things. So in the trenches, where no one moved, you had your front line and all your donors were back in the barracks. Once they started moving with tanks, you had your donors spread out all over the place. So you couldn't do the direct transfusion. American and Canadian surgeons at the Western Front actually favoured the practice of transfusion. And one of their lead people, Oswald Robertson, established the first blood bank in 1918 and was actually using citrate to anticoagulate it eventually. Initially though, he would collect it and they would defibrillate it. It wasn't until the Spanish Civil War in 1937 and 39, and no one's ever heard of the Spanish War, was the first blood bank was set up. In terms of publications, it was only the army surgeons publishing their findings, and even now, and Michael, you know, when they talk about damage control, resuscitation, and all the recent advances, that's all come from the Iraq War. All of the things where the army surgeons publish their findings end up going into the civilian. And in 1939, it was the Army Blood Supply Depot, that set up the first military transfusion service in the world. So let's have a look. World War I, 1914 to 1917. Belgium discovered that sodium citrate in tolerable quantities would anticoagulate blood. Lewisham and Agoti anticoagulated blood and infused it into patients without harm. And the British Army were routinely using direct transfusion to treat combat casualties. So that's Kryle's method. You stand there. Whereas the Canadians and the Americans were using transfused stored stuff. Surgeons did, however, believe that shock due to inadequate arterial pressure rather than inadequate capillary perfusion caused the problem. And you also have to remember the British went into World War I on horseback and with sabres, and the Germans were there with machine guns. So the first casualties that were in World War I were wounds and injuries that people had never seen before. So it's a credit to the Americans and Canadians that they actually thought massive wounds, massive bleeding, will transfuse them. So Robertson in 18 actually concluded that blood could be stored, not refrigerated, for 10 to 14 days. And in 1918 thought that glucose added to blood would actually make it last longer. It wasn't for another 20 years that glucose was incorporated into anticoagulants. So there again, same thing. Good ideas take a long time. Now we're going to diversify and have a little bit of fun. Because Between the war years, the only time I could find anyone who did any really significant research was this guy here, Alexander Bogdanov. He started experiments with transfusion, but he was far from altruistic. He thought that it was the liquid legend of life that would rejuvenate him and return his youth. He thought infusion held the key, and after 11 transfusions noted his eyesight had improved, his balding was suspended, along with what he described as other benefits. We won't go there. Sadly, the 12th transfusion killed him, because unfortunately the student who he bled, and you just imagine he's got a whole group of students and they probably all had to donate blood and, infusing himself. He got transfused with a student who had malaria and TB, which he contracted, and it killed him. On the basis of that, he did set up the Central Institute of Haematology in Moscow, which was one of the early centres for haematological excellence in the world. One of his students, Shaman, conducted experiments to see if cadaver blood was safe. And in 1930, Sergei Yudin, a Russian surgeon, and this Vrachebnaya Etika, physicians forward, decided to experiment. He was in the emergency department when a young male suicide victim was admitted in a moribund state, and he decided he would save him. Having stitched him up, he found that he was still oozing and had lost a lot of blood. So he raced to the morgue, saw that there was a recent cadaver had been brought in, sliced open the body to expose the vena cava, plunged a needle into the vein and started drawing blood. He then took a syringe with the blood and injected into the radial artery of the patient and infused 150 ml of blood, and to his joy resuscitated the patient. And so began the Russian cadaver blood collection program. It was actually adopted. Two Chicago doctors in 1935 performed 35 cadaver transfusions. Anyone in the room know who Dr. Kevorkian is? There. He was later famous for being Dr. Death. He was the man that started the euthanasia debate in America. Well, it seems that he was, doing lots of things with cadavers long before then, and they successfully transfused 35 people with cadaver blood. There is only one drawback. In our system, we get donors back every 3 months. Cadavers, you only get once. The Spanish Civil War. Now, anyone who's been to Spain, I didn't realise this until I went to Spain. It's a really big deal. It tore the country apart. And for the first time with modern weaponry, doctors were worried that with the civilian and military, because it wasn't just armies fighting each other, it was Spaniard fighting Spaniard. So civilian casualties were high. So major initiatives were undertaken to actually set up and establish a large-scale blood bank. Federico Duran Corda organised a highly successful mobile blood bank and collected blood into glass bottles containing a citrate and glucose solution. This was some 20 years after Robertson had said, I think glucose would be good. In 1938 he moved to Hammersmith in the UK and was integral in the setup of their pre-war blood collection. The reason he left Spain was he was on the wrong side. He was against Franco, and once Franco won, if that was found out, you either end up in jail or shot. So the UK's good fortune was Spain's poor fortune. And of course, the Ministry of Defence in London, when it was published 50 years later, were aware of war coming to Europe, and they started to consider transfusion support in the event of war. Which brings us to this fine gentleman, Patrick Mollison. The Ministry of Defence in London considered that blood transfusion support would be vital in the ensuing conflict. The Army Blood Supply Depot, as I said, opened in 1939, and they processed in excess of 33,000 donations in their first year. Patrick Mollison was seconded to the South London Blood Supply Depot, where his job was to direct civilian casualties and carry out research into making transfusion safer. This is where the rules and regulation bit comes in, because if you looked at today with double randomised, double-blind trials, hospital ethics, none of what Mollison did would have been allowed. They were collecting plasma, and they knew that if you let the bottle sit, the plasma would sit on top and the red cells would go down the bottom. They were taking the plasma off and using that as a resuscitation fluid. He was smart to say, I'll have the red cells. I think I might have a use for them. And was actually giving what really were packed red cells. He came up with a formula of 2% disodium citrate and 3% dextrose and a way to sterilise it without making the sugar caramelise, and blood would last for 21 days. That was ACD. Now you've got to be a really old blood banker to remember blood being collected, Michael's smiling, to remember ACD, which became citrate phosphate dextrose, but that was Mollison. And that remained in use till the mid-1970s. You've got to remember the first air raids in the Blitz had injuries which they'd never seen before. Crush injuries, burns, amputations, blast injuries. If you don't even have to be injured or damaged by a blast, just the concussion of the force hitting your abdomen is the same as getting hit with a sledgehammer. So he was doing stuff that they'd never done before. In December 1940, Sharp and Dome found that they could produce a freeze-dried form of plasma, which came out as a fine golden yellow powder that would remain sterile for years and can be reconstituted with the addition of water. Now, interestingly, freeze-drying wasn't something that was new. It had actually been developed in 1930 and was often used for preserving rare anti-sera or something, or preserving it. It was only with the advent of war that someone thought we could go into mass production, and then you could have your powder, a bit of water, and out in the field add water into a bag, and you could actually hook it up to a soldier and get them back to the army hospital. The army actually developed into a large-scale process, and in 1944 and 45, just before the invasion of Normandy, they produced over 250,000 400ml bottles of freeze-dried plasma, in addition to all the liquid stuff. So, the net result is Britain entered the war with large amounts of stocks of blood and plasma. The Blitz on September 7th, 1940 created unprecedented injuries, and 10% of the wounded needed transfusion. John Elliott, who was the lab director at Carolina, was experimenting with blood and was convinced that the best transfusion fluid available was plasma. And in 1940, an American doctor, Dr. Charles Drew, actually created and implemented the Blood for Britain campaign, where Americans were actually donating blood and plasma and shipping it across to the UK. There's a whole chapter in that because they were pooling the plasma, and it's a very ugly side of American politics at the time, that the real battle raged as to whether you were actually allowed to collect Negro plasma and whether you were actually able to mix it. The English didn't really care. There's a whole chapter in that book by Doug Starr on blood describing that. A little bit about Australia, because Australia's got a fairly good connection here. In 1939, the first emergency blood transfusion was set up in Victoria. 1940, pooled human serum was sent to CSL. And in 1941, the Red Cross took over blood transfusion services in every capital city to organise collection of donors. This was at the start of World War II. Blood Transfusion Subcommittee formed a report establishing a transfusion service in Sydney. It recommended that the Red Cross Society take over donor recruiting, and a Dr. R. Walsh And again, old blood bankers will remember a book called Ward and Walsh. He was one of the originals. He was straight out of medical school, wasn't able to join the army because he had hypertension, but was asked if he would like to take over as commander of the transfusion service. Immediately was enlisted under special medical thing and took over. And their aim was to procure serum for troops in the Middle East. Dr. Walsh established and took over as commanding officer throughout the war, and they also supplied blood to the US in 44 and 45 in the Pacific. And in 1945, at the end of hostilities, the Red Cross took it back from the army. It's also worth noting, because this will come up post-war, the Australian connection, a company called Tutor, was established by Bruce Rose, a former RAF pilot, who became a bit of an expert in Perspex, which was invented in World War II. He had expertise in handling this product and actually created a single-use petri dish. He then teamed up with another guy, Len Wisden, a microbiologist at Melbourne Uni, who pioneered, with this technology, the creation of a plastic blood collection and transfusion set that was requested by the Blood Transfusion Service. Why is this so significant? Well, in the war years, that there is Dr. Charles True. So you've got 50% blood loss identified as lethal, 10% of people in the Blitz needing transfusion, and freeze-dried plasma. This gentleman here that looks a bit like Alfred Hitchcock, chemist Edward Cohn, was employed. He was a Harvard chemist who was given the task of, can you try and work out how to extract all the proteins from plasma? Plasma is a very complex product. It's clear, it's 93% water, 1% salt, and 6% assorted proteins. He was able to prepare large amounts of relatively pure albumin and develop what's now known as the Cohn fractionation process. Fraction 2 gets out all the clotting factors. I think 3 gets out the immunoglobulins. 4 gets out the albumin. And unfortunately, fraction 1 is where all the viruses go. And for a long time, fibrinogen was that. As luck would have it, he timed it beautifully. In December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and they were immediately able to send enough albumin to treat 87 patients with stunning results. No clinical trials, no randomised trial. It's just, here's the albumin, put it in, it worked. So, rules and regulations. With the invasion of Europe imminent, the army was shipping 2,000 units a day because they reckoned that when they invaded Normandy, it would be a bloodbath. The thing was, Germany was hampered in its research because it would only accept donors and blood from the master race. You had to be Aryan. And since they were all fighting on the front line, they had no donors. And Japan rejected foreign science and was still employing primitive arm-to-arm transfusions at the end of the war. So the Allies got it right, did the science, implemented it, and was one of the reasons why they actually ended up winning. Some images of a very, very old, I think I used to have one of those in my garage of my beer fridge, with the bottles. This was a filled syringe for transfusing, so you could make up the plasma, add water, up with the syringe, put needle in, and then infuse the plasma in. The ad that went out everywhere to get people to donate plasma pre-invasion of Normandy, that was in Sicily, and that ended up becoming this iconic poster, which was used to try and a new war weapon to save lives. Subsequent conflicts, Korea, Vietnam and Iraq. In the interest of time, I'll go through them fairly quickly. Korea, only Group O blood was issued because it was thought that they could eliminate cross-matching technicians and they had enough stock. In 1952, approximately 50,000 transfusions were performed in Korea. Fenwal in America, at the same time that Len Wisdom was coming up with the tutor bag, Fenwal came up with their own version of a plastic bag. And of course, our old friend, the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH, was invented. And the use of helicopters to transport patients to various sites. I asked Michael before, you've got a helipad out there. We can thank MASH for that. In '65, in the Vietnam War, the Americans set up a centralised blood bank in Saigon. They got 1.5 million donors for 1.8 million units, all volunteer military personnel. Interestingly enough, 22% of the soldiers contracted hepatitis. After the Vietnam War, they maintained that collection base, and they've set up military bases and military hospitals all around the world. The 91 Gulf War, 100,000 units were used in the OR. We had Novo 7 available, which had been used extensively in Israel, particularly to deal with casualties from suicide bombers on buses. And in 2003, the US military invented the Golden Hour blood container, the basis of which the Blood Service now has their transport container and everything else. Special tourniquets, battlefield dressings with fibre bandages, all designed to reduce blood loss. So, again, nothing happens unless you have a war. The main one is this concept of a lethal triad. Coagulopathy caused by acidosis and hypothermia led to what we now call damage control surgery. We've learned that combat transfusion support needs special blood transport containers, mobile walk-in donors. The US say that every serving GI is tested for HIV and Hep B. I'm not sure how often they test them, but when they leave America they are. It led to the development of what is widely used now as the ratio of fresh plasma with packed cells and red cells, monitoring of hemostasis. There was excitement. I'm told the thromboelastogram is on its way here. Recombinant factor 8. Recombinant factor 7 reduced red cell use by 20%. It didn't change the mortality, but it just meant you didn't have the bloodbath or the great loss of a limited resource. The picture down here, a lot of these, there's a classic 3-limb injury, stepped on a landmine, both legs removed and the arm. Normally that would have been fatal. It's not anymore. It's remarkable what they do, and a lot of it around bleeding and stopping the bleeding, and of course that has now slipped into the civilian population. So innovations, a bit like the Monty Python. What have the Romans done for us? What has war done for us? Well, compatibility testing, anticoagulants, preservatives, blood banks, fridges, venous access, plastic blood bags, component administration, infectious disease testing, and high-risk donor screening. Not a bad record. As I mentioned before, anticoagulants and everything from 1835 took a long time to get it right. There's our old friend Braxton Hicks, unsuccessfully using CP, so 43, Mollison, ACD, and hasn't been much change these days. Now we're into an era where we're all familiar with, so I'm not going to take too long going over these. Transfusion-transmitted disease, it's now recognised that viruses, parasites, bacteria, and even variant CJD. And this is some of the artwork of Keith Haring, who was a HIV sufferer who passed away, but his artwork, very distinctive and was used to highlight, HIV, AIDS, and its link with blood transfusion. Some of the lessons we've learnt. 60s and 70s, there was significant transfusion-transmitted disease. There was an era where there was Hep B and then there was non-A, non-B because they knew there was something there, they just couldn't find the effective agent. For a brief period of time there, autologous blood came into vogue. No one wanted to get that really dirty, rotten stuff from someone else, only get your own. Did you know that today more than 40 diseases exist that were not heard of a generation ago. And as a result, the AEBB has set up a committee, as you do, to describe, prioritise emerging infectious diseases and their agents to see what effect they may have. And my old boss, who looked after all the haemophiliacs, was always going on. Her biggest fear was what she called NBV, the next bloody virus. Now, thankfully, since the mid-80s, we haven't really had that. But if you're in America, West Nile is certainly a big issue, and it's certainly transmissible, and it's certainly nasty. Other things are impact on a person's immune system. There's lots of papers around about transfusing people actually lowers your immunity. But these days, screening for viral markers, removal of white cells, the blood supply is probably as safe as it's ever been. I think the last time I looked, the risk, you've got a greater risk of getting hit by lightning than you have of getting HIV. I think it's about 1 in 14 million. So internationally, blood banks are very well regulated these days, so maybe rules and regulations in some instances are good. The art and why. These two papers, I love Old English, the last stages of phthisis, or transfusion of blood. This sounds better when you read it out because it's written in Old English, and I can talk about never get to the point. There has been a revival in 1819 through the experiments of Dr. Blundell in London. There appears to be an auspicious period for such a thorough scientific investigation of the whole subject, as the exacting spirit of the age demands. As such, we may effect the establishment of some principles by which we may be guided in forming an opinion as to the propriety of the operation and as to the details of its execution. In other words, maybe we should actually have some guidelines. At present, we are to employ an expressive, if not scientific phrase, all at sea on this subject. So I think the NBA started putting out protocols about late 2008, 2009. So 1800 to 2010, only 200 years for someone to come up with a protocol. You know, can't expect things to happen. And of course the bottom line is whether blood is necessary, whether animal or human, or whether animal blood is even safe in a healthy subject. We've been screaming out for guidelines for 200 years. It took a long time. Nowadays, the NBA do go to a bit of effort. The only thing the objection I have with the NBA is they think you go to their website and check it out and read it every day. And they were really disappointed when I said, in my experience, that doesn't happen. But if you did, you'd find that they've got news releases, they have a project on trying to reduce waste. The big one here is doing project management for them. They spend $1.1 billion a year. 640 mil goes onto fresh products to fund the transfusion service, blood collection, consumables, staff, nursing, everything else. And the other 460 odd mil goes on all of the non-blood stuff, recombinant. And that's why blood banks have to stock it, because it comes under the NBA and they pay for it. Pharmacy would probably be the ideal place for it, but blood banks get it because it's a blood product, even though it isn't, if you can make sense of that. It is good, though, that they do put on their site what they issue, what they manage, and the sort of budgeting that they've got. You've got your fresh products, you've got your CSL products, you've got your clotting factors, your immunoglobulins, and boy do they cost. And the good thing here is they've actually started to put prices on them. Because if you look at other industries, blood's not that unique. Milk is, perishable. Supermarkets certainly manage. Pharmacies manage. They do all the inventory. Why the hell, what's going on with the blood industry? Why isn't that working? The reason is all the others, if you waste it or don't use it, it costs money. So the NBA strategy was to affix a cost initially, just to give you an idea, but longer term, if people don't modify their behaviour, they might start sending invoices out. So immunoglobulin, 200 mils, 12 grams, $750. Not cheap. and of course their guidelines. And the first four: critical bleeding, perioperative, medical, critical care. So 200 years in the making. So at last, I'd like to say we are not all at sea. And then of course they brought out Standard 7, and I'm not going to go through Standard 7 other than to say, for the first time ever, governance and systems for blood and blood prescribing have been published. And it always surprised me that you could take an order for blood over the phone, whereas our pharmacy at the Alfred, you couldn't get anything out of them unless it was in writing, signed, and sometimes in duplicate. Even radiology wouldn't take a picture of you unless they had the doctor's signature. Whereas we'll get phone calls from theatre, from all sorts of places. You know, can you add a couple of units on? You know? Works, but when you think about it, what's the governance that's there? So this is the change that's happening. I wouldn't be a blood banker if I didn't mention compatibility testing. And my favourite bit is always the story that Robin Coombs used to tell, along with Arthur Morant and Race, when they came up with the concept for anti-human serum. Now, it wasn't new. Other people had thought of it. They were the first to put it in practice. And I loved that back in those days, they said there was a 2-hour incubation. And that was because they used to set them up just before lunch, go down to the boozer and come back 2 hours later and do all their Coombs testing. You know, it's now down to 10 minutes or less, and we've got antibody screening, grip screen at whole, column technology, and I was really keen to see you've got a molecular biology, because that's the next area, you know, looking at the antigens at the molecular level. Substitutes. 1874, Stuart Mudd, whose name probably is that, my professor of bacteriology, suggested that milk would be the best substitute for blood. Might work in Japan where that pale complexion works. We do have oxygen carrying chemicals, perfluorocarbons and hemoglobin based, but that's not their solution. You can give someone the ability to carry oxygen, but unless you've got clotting factors, you're not going to stop them bleeding. And no one has come up with a substitute for a platelet. So if someone doesn't want to get a human transfusion and doesn't want to bleed, I don't like their chances. Erythropoietin, well used by athletes and bike riders in the Tour de France. Growth factors and recombinant products are all available. So, look, who knows what the next 10 years will bring. I actually have a HP printer at home, and I can testify, having bought the cartridges, that the most expensive fluid on the planet at 70 cents per mil is their ink. Cost of blood is actually 40 cents per mil in its pure form. Really good stuff like vodka and Red Bull comes in at about 5 cents per mil to manufacture, and crude oil is about 2 cents per mil. So blood is a highly expensive commodity. That was in 2011. Yeah, not quite as fancy a graph as this one. And 2013, there'd been little change. HP is still ripping the world off, and blood still costs an awful lot. So hemovigilance, you've got Standard 7, informed consent, you've got incident reporting, evidence-based medicine, transfusion triggers, and the hazards are well identified. And of course, informed consent, this is a risky one. Asking your patient whether they actually want to get transfused. Once upon a time, the doctor said, I'm going to give you a couple of units. Lots of people using Dr. Google now and saying, yes, and what's the transfusion trigger? And the legal system is set up so that if someone does have an adverse reaction, poor outcome, or gets that NDV, if you transfuse them and there's not evidence of what the transfusion trigger was in their history, you're in trouble. Legally, you are in trouble. And the blanket consent form you sign when you come into hospital that says we can do anything we like to you whenever we want, doesn't count. Because there's enough, this is let the genie out the bottle, there is enough information out there for people to know and acknowledge what the hazards are, and that therefore is deemed that, well, you shouldn't really proceed. Whereas, one of the things that was good early on, blissfully ignorant, no one knew. Now they do. Tread warily. Patient ID, I've just put that there because the hardest thing to do is to actually identify someone these days. And the best case the Alfred had was the two guys that had been out drinking, rolled their car, one ended up in Bendigo, Clink, and the other ended up in our trauma unit. We did all the work on him, and the police rang the next day and said, John Smith, you got him there? Yes. Well, actually, we've got him here. John Smith had actually given his wallet to his mate who had it in his pocket, and that's how he was identified. He's actually such and such. Oh, good. So now we've got to go back and start all over again and redo it all and reissue it. Hence, the only message there is the specimen for blood's valid for 72 hours, and these days on an electronic system, electrons travel really, really quickly, much quicker than bits of paper used to 20 years ago. So patient identification is a real issue. Inventory, my favourite subject because that was my project. All I say is it's a trade-off between shortage and wastage. And I believe it should be the laboratories that know best what their average daily use is. They should define what their trigger point is. The way the Australian systems work is you always get topped up to a level. Supermarkets don't top up to a level. They restock when they get down to a certain level. It's a different model. So if you say use 20 group O's a day, not irradiate or anything else, and you want to have 5 days worth, you should have 100 units in your fridge is your maximum. But you know that you probably don't want to have any, you don't want to get down to a day's worth, so that means if you got down to 20, you should be getting restocked, or the trigger should be at 2 days, you need to restock me. That's not how the systems worked. Hopefully when they automate it, interface it and everything, will start to work more like a supermarket, because they look at us and go, you've got what, 40 products in your fridge? I've got 5,000 products on my shelf that I manage an inventory for. Don't tell me you can't manage 4. And a famous line accredited to me that it's easier to track a pack of frozen peas in a supermarket than a bag of blood in a chain. The things to leave you with, because you've got to finish strong, is change is inevitable, but change is constant. Benjamin Disraeli, when you finish changing, you're finished. Ben Franklin, and George Bernard Shaw once says, progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. That's one to throw at Red Cross. So what have we learned? Getting back to my conclusion, hopefully I've sparked your interest. The 1880s, to use my art term, was the renaissance of blood transfusion. Blood is certainly more safe than it's ever been, particularly with transfusion-transmitted disease. I checked the ISBT website the other day. If you were to actually look at all the blood products that were available, if you took a paediatric pack and gave each paediatric pack its own individual barcode, which is how pharmacies and supermarkets break everything up, and gave it its own unique barcode, there would be 750 different listed products. Now, Codabar doesn't work for that. ISBT 128 does. And it's an indictment on the Australian system that this was supposed to be implemented in 2012, and in 2015 it still hasn't happened. And that's the only way hospital blood banks will be able to manage the inventories. Government regulation and patient blood management is a hot topic. I wish inventory was. I think I've proven that change is slow. 180 years, 39 years, sometimes it takes a long time. The costs are rising and will continue to rise. And as an art, it's quite complex. Just to, I can send these on to Donna and she can pass them, but just to give you a couple ideas, some of the references, Leviticus, Annals of Surgery, Harvey's original document. Of course, I wrote everything in bloody Latin. Praelectiones Anatomiae Univalis in 1616. But there was a fair bit in there to go through. And I'd like to thank you for your time, your patience, and for listening to me.
I'll throw to the regions. Is there any questions for Jeff outside Townsville?
You're still there.
No, nothing from Mackay, thank you.
Okay, how about Townsville? I'm sure you're all itching, chomping at the bit.
Jeff, there's an old furphy that floats around out here about the Second World War up in the Pacific, where coconuts were used for plasma, or as an
Coconut milk,
sorry.
yeah. Coconut
Is that
water,
true?
yes.
It is. Yeah, I think.
I do.
Yeah. Yeah. When I said that milk as a substitute,
Yeah.
milk actually can be used, but it doesn't have any it doesn't have any red cells, it doesn't have any plasma protein. It just happens to be a slightly isotonic fluid, which isn't going to kill you, but it's not going to. And if you just wanted to use it as a volume expander, yeah, it may well.
And do you think we'll ever go back in trauma to using fresh whole blood, which is arguably acute blood loss?
In the military, yes, and they do, and they swear by it. But there's no real rationale in civilian medicine to do it because there is a risk associated with it. And if you look at the biggest thing is in the milk, the Alfred experience was it was 1-to-1, 1 bag of red cells, 1 bag of plasma. We found that it was 1 bag of plasma for every 2 bags of red cells. We also had access to more coagulation, better ways of becoming empirical, actually dosing. So instead of bags, it was how many mils of FFP should we give?
We used to have emergency donor panels in the regional centres here. The trouble was when they called up the O negatives, everyone was down the pub usually, and that's where they'd go to find them. And victims were good.
It's horses for courses. One of the ladies I went to uni with gave a talk in Melbourne. She went and did a stint as the locum on Norfolk Island. And she spoke about she was unlucky enough for the one motor car accident for the year, and the patient was brought into hospital, and they actually had their donor panel. And she rang someone at 2 in the morning who came in and read the instructions, and it said, there is the blood pack, there's the needle, and she actually had to do the phlebotomy to collect the blood bag to then do the cross match to then give it to the patient. So, that wasn't it. She said that wasn't in the job description. But
Thinking on feet.
if you look at the way it is these days, and let's give Red Cross some credit, with the fractionation and the products that are available and the transportation, there's probably no reason to need to give FFP. And the military have proven if you act quickly, and it's that acidosis, and if someone's acidotic, it's no good giving them Novo 7 because it doesn't work at that pH. If you haven't got platelets, Novo 7 won't work either. So there's still a lot more to learn.
Okay, if there's no more questions, thank you very much, Jeff. Stay, everyone. We've got one of our local identities following up with her presentation. So without, I'd really like to invite Lena to come and speak. So thank you very much, Jeff.
Do you know where your talk is?
It's on our drive, so I'm going to have to open that.
Okay.
While we're just waiting for everybody to change their talks, I'll just do a little plug for AIMS. Tonight's AIMS Tropical Division, that's bringing you all your nibblies. If anybody in the regions wants me to pay for their pizzas, they can just send their receipts and we'll organise that. But if anybody would like an APACE certificate, everybody knows my email address, just flick me an email and I'll pass it on. Any other questions around that? No, I think that'll do it. So, and of course, thank you, ALE, for organising everything for us. You ready?
Almost.
Sorry.
Find the phone.
Maybe 5 weeks.
Just gonna walk
Here it is.
Rewind. Thank you.
It helps with stairwell.
Okay, so where's this one? There it is.
Move it around.
So this is quite a different vibe, my talk, but hopefully, yeah, you'll find it a little interesting. It's actually a case of an involuntary transfusion. So it was a case that we came across on an evening shift I had in transfusion in April. So in the afternoon of the 22nd of April, a 33-year-old woman presented to Women's and Children's Clinic here at the hospital, and they collected blood for full blood count, urea electrolytes, liver function tests, urate, group and antibodies, and CMV toxoplasma and parvovirus serology. There was a clinical note, query fetal anemia. We had no previous history on this patient. So it looked like some sort of routine antenatal screen. The patient's full blood count was normal, and so was her biochemistry. There was slightly lowered albumin and slightly elevated ALP. However, in hindsight, when we knew her gestational age, that was within normal range. The interesting result was this mixed field in the grouping card. In the forward group of the anti-B well, there were negative cells. This patient was AB positive. So we do our grouping group and screens generally on the BioRad IH1000. It takes a picture of the card, and here on the left side you can see the anti-B well enlarged, and at the very bottom there's a small quantity of negative cells. This is what we call a mixed field or dual population, and it's always considered abnormal. And it needs to be investigated. The most normal causes of mixed field are red cell transfusion with another group, so often an AB positive patient might be given A positive blood, in which case you would have some B negative cells present, approximately in that quantity if it were 1 unit. Also in bone marrow transplants, when the patient is converting to the donor's blood group, you'll see a mixed field. And there's also a very rare case of chimerism, which results from the exchange of hematopoietic cells between dizygotic twins in utero. So it's very rare. So this lady had not had a transfusion with us. We phoned the other local labs to see if they had transfused her, maybe, I don't know, for anemia. I don't know if they ever transfuse anyone during pregnancy, but anyway, we called around. SMP had a recent group, no transfusions there. QML also had a recent group. They had not seen any mixed field in their group reaction, and they had not given her any transfusion. They did, however, have a gestational age from which we then could calculate that the patient was now in her 33rd week. Sort of useful information when you're testing her pregnantly. So why the mixed field? Going back to the request form again, the ball dropped. If they think the fetus has anemia, again, this was the only way we knew that she was even pregnant. Is the baby bleeding into the mum? Is it a fetal-maternal hemorrhage? So are those B negative cells actually fetal cells? So because this was seemingly a routine group and antibody screen, the sample had not been marked as urgent. It was performed in due time with the other routine samples. But the urgency of the matter was becoming clear if we were actually seeing fetal cells. So we did a Kleihauer stain to confirm the fetal-maternal hemorrhage hypothesis. So the Kleihauer stain is normally performed on rhesus-negative women post-delivery to assess the degree of sensitization, or if they're querying placental abruption or abdominal trauma. Smears are made from an EDTA sample, usually the full blood count sample, and are stained together with a positive and negative control. The stain detects hemoglobin F, which is present in fetal cells, because it's more resistant to acid elution than normal adult hemoglobin, and then is stained up by eosin. So this is our positive and negative control slides. to your left is the positive control, which is made up of cord cells in normal male blood, which is selected for sort of a low hemoglobin. And the negative control is the same male blood, and this is to exclude the possibility of any fetal cells actually being present in the control. And also, generally pregnant women have a lower HB. So, I guess to get the slide even. This was the patient slide. So, we thought it might be a good idea to call the doctor. So we called them again and said we had evidence of a large fetal-maternal hemorrhage. We hadn't done a count yet, but I estimated 15 mils. Given that a term baby has about 200 mils of blood, that's pretty substantial bleed. So they were going to take this information, find out where the patient was, and do whatever they do on the other side of the phone. In the meantime, we attempted a count, which was quite difficult. Even in the RCPA samples we get, we've never seen anything so densely staining. So between the three of us scientists that were there that night, we counted 90 mils, 120 mils, and 140 mils. Maybe if we had repeated it a few times, practiced, got our eye in, maybe our precision would have increased, but we decided it was purely academic. We reported the middle value, which was 120 mils. We referred it to Royal Brisbane, hoping to get an accurate count the next day, but they didn't bother. Not important. That was a bit unfortunate. It would have been interesting to see if we were, remotely close. I actually did a count under 100 and oil because I counted as a percentage of actual red cells in the field rather than our usual estimation. So we called them again with our count, and then we found out that they were planning an emergency cesarean. And this decision was based on CTG that had shown a normal fetal heart sounds together with our CLI-HAR result. So this was the mum's full blood count pre-op at 10 o'clock that night. Interestingly, her hemoglobin had gone up. Was that baby cells? She must have been feeling pretty good. Then they delivered the baby at around 11 o'clock. And we did a cord blood group and Coombs screen, and baby was in fact A positive, which fit the picture. Hemoglobin was 38, which also fit our count, actually. Because if you consider that a normal hemoglobin for a 33-week baby is about 150, take off 60%, take off 70%, you get about 40. So it made sense. So it's nice in hindsight, evidence builds up. Obviously they were severely hypoxic as well. This is from the point of care radiometer blood gas analyzer in NICU. And then when we received the first full blood count on the baby, our hemoglobin was 39, so that was pretty accurate. As you can see from the baby's full blood count, there was a frank bleed because there's pancytopenia here. Also, you can see that the bone marrow has started to respond with a high MCV demonstrating retics and immature red cells, and the RDW as well is elevated. Lots of new creds, of course. And all these parameters were supported by the morphology review. So, of course, then they requested a cross-match on the baby. I think this was the first time we found, well, we had calculated their gestational age, but now they gave us that information as well. So because the mother's antibody screen was negative, we assume Bub is negative because they don't start producing antibodies for about 4 months. We generally issue, we always issue CMV negative and irradiated units for neonates and fresh blood, of course. We had one pediatric pack that was compatible, which is about 60 mils. So If they had let 120, they were going to need more than that. So we also cross-matched an adult bag, which is 250 mils. So that was certainly going to be enough. After the first pediatric bag had been transfused, the baby's HB was up to 88. And sometime later, they transfused the second bag. It came up to 146 with O2 sets, back to looking good. So this was by noon the following day. So by this time, the obstetrician had actually phoned the lab and thanked us for picking up that hemorrhage because he hadn't thought of it. Because there had been no bleeding, no trauma. And the patient had just been referred to the hospital by her GP because of an abnormal ultrasound scan that hinted that the fetus might be anemic. And she had always had reduced fetal movement in this pregnancy. And then when she came to Women's and Children's Clinic, they had connected her to the cardiotopograph for monitoring. And the fetal heart tones were non-reassuring, as they express it. And so this is an indication for immediate delivery, but then when they found, or when we called with our higher result, there was no doubt as to what was going on. So some days later, this is the baby's full blood count. Obviously a little bit hematologically stressed, but doing well. They did histo on the mum's placenta, obviously to look for a reason for the fetal-maternal hemorrhage, but there was none. It looked essentially normal. There was no evidence of infection. So that was a little bit odd. All of the serology that had been requested came back negative, so there was no viral infection there either. So why the fetal-maternal hemorrhage? Well, in hindsight, she reckoned she had maybe bumped her belly on the kitchen counter that day. So that's it. Anyway, that will, probably remain a mystery. But there are things to be learned from this case. And interestingly, in this case, the mode of sampling made a huge difference. Because when we centrifuge the EDTA to separate the cells from the plasma, if there are, the neonatal cells are larger, so they'll be found at a larger quantity in the very bottom of the tube. And our analyzer actually samples from the bottom of the tube. Whereas when we do it manually, we tend to, just by a function of the pipette tip being so long, we take cells from the top of the cell column. And so to the left, so we actually brought out her blood again and redid this the next day. And in the image on the left is her group with cells from the top of the cell column, and the repeat on the analyzer, which was cells from the bottom. Or actually, I think I did it manually, cells from the bottom. So you can see on the left there, like you could actually see a few cells, but it was so minute that the banjo would have missed it, and if you looked quickly, you would have missed it. Whereas one on the right is clearly visible there. Well, to summarise, we got lucky. If Mum and Bub's groups had been the same, we wouldn't have seen it. If we had done this test manually because they'd collected a short sample, or they'd put a large label on, or something as trivial as that, we would have missed it. Ironically, the bleed was so big we could see it. And but also good practice made a difference here, because that little bit of clinical note was enough for us to action. If there had not been that clinical note, we would have put a note in the communication book going, this needs to be followed up. Maybe we have to find out if she's been treated out of town. Has she had a transfusion? What is this mixed field about? It's not like, maybe we would have called Mike and brainstormed, but yeah, it was really having that clinical note there that made us realize what was going on. And we followed it up appropriately and initiated the further investigations based on what we suspected could be a medical emergency. So, yes, this just highlights that it's very important and that the scientists can critically evaluate situations in context of clinical scenarios, given that we are provided with some information. That's it.
Thank you very much, Lena. Is there any questions from the regions?
No questions from Mount Isa, but thanks, Lena. That was really great. We had a lot of conversation during that talk, and we lots of conversation about paediatric transfusion, which we don't do here. So that was really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
How about Mackay?
No, we got nothing, thanks. Thank you, Lena. It was interesting.
Thank you.
What about Townsville? Burning questions. Ailey's straight in there. She's so rapid.
With the increased nuke red count and the very high MCV, do you think that would lend evidence to the fact that it was a slow chronic bleed and not an acute bleed? It seems highly unlikely she bumped her belly on the kitchen.
No.
Yeah, I know.
Massive feet over hemorrhage. Wouldn't that,
And you'd
wouldn't
think-
that suggest that's a slow bleed, a slow leaky bleed?
Yeah, and you would think also that in the histology that they would find evidence of an actual rupture or something, you know, for that amount of blood to go through.
I think it was David that did that one, wasn't it? Yeah.
But also, I mean, the baby was quite premature, 33 weeks. We might, you know, consider a new grade count almost normal for such a preemie. I mean, a few hundred.
That MCV was massive.
Yeah, huge.
Yeah. It's just unfortunate that you never found out the cause.
Yeah.
It's completed the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's just strange because you think if there's a breach somewhere between, you know, the placenta, like you'd think she would have some bleeding.
Yeah.
How could it all perfectly go into the mother's, you know, circulation? It's very strange.
Why the hell wouldn't they do a float? You know,
No, they didn't do it because they reckoned didn't matter, that it was insignificant.
well, it probably didn't matter. I mean, you have often to see 100 mil bleed.
Yeah, that's right. Like, that is my curiosity for Christ's sake.
I'll make a comment. Lena, that's exceptional, and that just shows the value of switched-on medical scientists. It really does.
But it also shows the value of history.
The whole heap of
That
stuff.
if the doctors wrote clinical notes
20
down all
yeah,
the time, that it'd help us a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
In case they
Before we
have
jump to
pathology.
conclusions about what our central lab may or may not have done and the rationale, it'd be good to know that, and maybe
Yeah.
Mike or Andrew might just ask the question. It's also in immunology too. The flow cytometry at Royal Brisbane is not in haematology, it's immunology, and they might not have picked up on the haematological significance of that sample going down. It'd be very interesting to find out, because that's a critical part of that.
I
Because
kind of
that,
wanna-
you know, I mean, if a lab was not doing Flyhouse and sending them off, then
Yeah.
they might just, I'm not going to do that. And that baby might have died.
Yeah.
Because of our work, it's had a good year.
Well, they thought, you know, it would have bled out by morning if they decided to sleep on it and we hadn't, you know.
So they didn't think it was an acute bleed? Obviously, if that's what they said, then...
Well, I'm not sure about the rate of the bleed, but the severity of the bleed at the time that we found it
Yeah.
was critical.
Yeah, well, it's amazing the baby survived all that.
Yeah.
The time frames, if you notice the time frames, I mean, from when the routine antenatal came in to when that baby was delivered is what, 6 hours?
Yeah.
And that's phenomenal.
And we, well, in hindsight, I felt like, oh my God, we were so slow. We were having dinner, we restained the slide because something stuffed up, and we didn't realize the importance until it all kind of fell into place, and then it was already 9 o'clock, you know. So, in hindsight, it could have been done quicker, but we just didn't understand the implications until, you know, it had all happened. So, yeah.
Is it different with twin-to-twin transfusion? This thing might help with the anatomy of this, but twin-to-twin transfusion versus fetal maternal bleed in the anatomy?
No, it's limited because the classic picture there is you get one child that looks really dark and one looks really pale.
Yeah.
They're limited by their circulation. So you end up with one severely anemic baby and one
Yeah.
with too much, but because there's a limited vascular space for them to bleed into, whereas a baby bleeding into a mum, there's an enormous vascular space
Yeah.
to bleed into.
So it's like a gradient.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quick, just a couple of comments though, because I know you went to a lot of trouble to work out the size of the bleed. All the things with Clyhowers, with the RCPA, it was designed, if you look at 6 mils, that's what the standard dose of anti-D is around. The Clyhower actually gets more accurate the bigger the bleed. So, you know, when you've got a massive bleed like that, it's actually highly accurate because your proportions are really good. So I can understand them not wanting to do the flow because it doesn't really, flow was brought in because you've got that small area. If it's 6 mils, is it 9 mils? Do I give them one dose of anti-D? Do I need to give them the second dose of anti-D? So it's not accurate around that area. Whereas what you've produced, it's going to be highly accurate.
Well, I mean, we had quite a range from 90 to 140.
Yeah, but that's sampling error, trying to work out what the size of the field is. And
Yeah.
you could safely say that you've got a 100 mil bleed, you know, whereas no one's really, the clinical intervention is going to be, holy mackerel, we've got a bleeding baby, we need to get it out. Whereas around the 6 mil markers, do I give them a second dose of anti-D? Which, the second point I was going to make was, if the lady was RH negative and the baby was RH positive and there's 90 mils of RH positive blood going in there, how many doses of anti-D would there be?
Yeah.
It's a very, very sore mum.
Yes. Leslie, did you have a question?
Well, actually, yes. Mine also, Jeff. I love that historical overview. And I just didn't, I was expecting you to say something about the Francis Blood Bank in Chicago. Because I thought they had a claim to fame as being the first in the US.
They do.
I may be wrong.
I've got a folder there full of, I just couldn't fit all of, Bernard Fantis is, you know, certainly on the list of publications there, but he did it in civilian. In the second after, I can actually show the reference to Bernard Fantis.
Because that's where I went. That's where I did my little
few
months of transfusion medicine here.
Yeah.
And you have this big plaque up there.
The main point was that people, if you get back to what the art of war, strategy and planning. If you had a planning and went through all lists, it was never going to work. They had strategies and they acted straight away. And Wollaston's book was about this thick with all the research things he'd done, which in this day and age he would never have been allowed to do. So we were sort of lucky in that regard, and that's what happens in conflict. Fantasy, he has a very big chunk of history, but I just couldn't fit everyone in.
I am disappointed you left out the Townsville link, because Noel Gutteridge actually performed the very first intrauterine transfusion here in Townsville, and he's the guy that started Kilmel. Yeah. And he was linked with the ARCB, but also the Australian College of Tropical Medicine, or what were they in those days? Anton Brynolf, yeah.
He's also linked with, I don't know, was or Bruce was with the Australian Army.
Oh, I think Bruce, yeah. But definitely a Townsville link there.
I can include.
I don't know, I'm just going to do one of my lectures, that's the only reason I remember.
I was wondering whether or not one of your references might have been the gospel too, and take the Holy Communion, take his blood, wine, and not even blood of Christ.
That was.
Did you pick up on that?
Pretty much summed up in that stage one. It started. It was for centuries. It was the liquid legend of life, and as you said, so many biblical, mystical, religious connotations. Body and blood. Having said Leviticus, you shouldn't eat blood, and then you've got a ceremony that's practiced every week where that's actually one of the symbolic.
Well, the book about a year in Provence, where the English journalists went to live in France, and they had a child in the village that had leukemia and needed a transplant and had to have blood transfusion. And the professor of the Paris Blood Bank came for this, and of course, typical French, they had a great spread on it. He said, "Oh, drink up plenty of wine, refresh the blood," which may or may not be quite clinically correct, but from a Frenchman's point of view, it certainly makes sense.
All right, well, once again, I'll have everybody thank our speakers, and thanks to all our people in the region.